Hey everyone, someone messaged me this morning and they said that I always write about my father and my grandfather, and which is true, and never write about my mother or her family, and I wanted to correct that. I wanted to make a quick video about my mother in particular. She was born in 1928 and her name was Cynthia Cabraji. Her father was a poet, a Parsi poet, which is a community. The Parsis are a community who fled Persia in the 8th century, I think, or even the 7th century. And they arrived in Gujarat because Islam was expanding and they were Zoroastrians and they were in danger of losing their lives. They didn't convert. My mother was born in Panchgani, which is near Pune in the hills, and lived her first 7 years there with her two brothers. And then they came to England by ship, arriving in 1936, I think, just in time for World War II. The reason my grandfather and my grandmother met was that my grandfather had come in the early 1920s to England from India on a kind of pilgrimage to meet Robert Graves, who was himself quite a young poet. And Graves was living in a little village called Islip outside Oxford. And when my grandfather visited, he saw a young lady across the garden fence, and her name was Eleanor Wilkinson, and that was my grandmother. And he swept her off her feet, I suppose, and they were married, and she went back to India with him. And that, as I say, is where my mother and her two brothers were born. My mother was an extremely larger than life character. She, if I could describe her in any way, she was all about creating and creativity and creation. She loved it when children were in the woods or down in the field making up games and singing songs they had done themselves and stomping through mud. With my mother, there was no problem ever being outside too much. I can remember at Langton House so often, she'd throw us out along with the dog and she'd always shout, "Go on, darlings, just play in the rain. It's very good for you." And so we did. And we had a fantastic time. When my mother was in her 20s, so after living through the Blitz, she got a job at a school in Suffolk that was really to change her life. It was called Summerhill, and it had been started by a very, very forward-thinking educationalist called A.S. Neal. And the idea was that if you wanted to go to school, you went to school. If you wanted to build tree houses and live in them, you did that. And whatever you wanted to do, you did. And my mother, as a house mistress there, saw that education was about play and about creating and about imagining, and that education should never be about memorizing nonsensical stuff that had no use, no practical use at all. And when I look back at my mother's life, it's this extraordinary practicality that runs through her life like a strong vein. She couldn't bear it when people were depressed or moaning or grumpy because life hadn't given them what they thought they should have. She was so practical, and she loved it when people just got on with it. And she would always say that the way to get out of depression, if you're depressed, is to make things, and it's to create. She was a great champion of knitting and creating using just a few, balls of yarn and a couple of knitting needles. And in the 1980s, she started a small charity called Safi, making very high-end sweaters that she designed and often made, and selling them and sending the profits to Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Here's a picture of my mother that I really like. It's from her passport in about 1960. And so she was about 31, 32. I love the hairstyle, and I'm very inspired by my father, but equally so by my mother. And I should say that although my mother's name, her first name was Cynthia, my father used to call her Kashfi as a nickname after Anna Kashfi, Marlon Brando's wife. And it was a nickname that stuck. So anyone who knew my mother after the age of about 30 called her Kashfi. And I know that my sisters and I are, supremely inspired, as I say, by her practicality and her ability to enthuse on everyone around her to create.